You found us through fly fishing. You'll stay for our passion and the community. Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Podcast.
Yeah, but he doesn't get it. How come fly fishermen don't get it?
You only haul with the short power snap.
Look for where people walk and the insides of bends and hunt those.
The roof blew off and the interior walls got sucked out. And the trees are just coming up. And I mean, he's clearly not going to clear the trees.
It is not a fly fishing story. It's a story about me trying to understand my brother through fly fishing.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today.
Before we get started, quick word from our sponsor, Smitty's Fly Box, delivering monthly flies, fly materials, and accessories each month with their Smitty's subscription fly box. Smitty's has been producing high-quality flies and materials for over 30 years, so now it's time to take the guesswork out of fly time materials and patterns. You can support this podcast right now and get a great selection of flies and fly time materials right now at Smitty's Fly Box. That's Smitty's, S-M-I-T-T-Y-S, Smitty'sFlybox.com. We've been waiting for you. Follow our guests, follow us on Instagram, and share this episode and the love if you enjoy this podcast. And we are live in 3, 2, 1. How you doing, Mark?
Hi, Dave. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on here. This has been an episode I've been wanting to do for actually a long time. Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway is obviously, I don't know. I mean, he's probably the most famous author of, it seems like, of all time. I've heard a lot about him. I haven't read as much as probably some people out there, but a lot of the famous authors that people I've talked to have, referenced him as a big influence. And so I'm going to talk about Hemingway. I want to get into what made Hemingway, because he's got a really amazing life and crazy life and story. But before we get there, let's take it back to you. You're a professor. You've got all sorts of, accolades behind you. Talk about what you do and how you came to, dig into Hemingway and what he does.
Well, I can tell you my origin story with Hemingway. I was very lucky in the sense that my parents were readers. So my mother was a writer, my father was a journalist, and everywhere in my house there were books and newspapers. I had an older brother, so there was always material around, and I was just a curious kid. And I really stumbled on Hemingway not in a university or in a high school classroom. I just started reading his books. I know that's sort of ironic to say because now I'm in the university teaching other kids. Right. But I just stumbled on him myself. And this is a world that is completely foreign to me. Bullfighting, deep sea fishing, hunting, safari, war, drinking, all the things that are really the opposite of what I do. Yet I just loved being part of the world. So it was really, Hemingway grabbed me, his style, the subject matter. And I've really been curious about him ever since those moments.
Right. That's it. To me too, it's all those things like the bullfighting, the war. War for me is probably the biggest one because I think I always kind of joke about it, but it's like, I knew that was one thing I never wanted to get involved with, but it seemed like for Hemingway that he really felt like, it was something he had to do. And he kind of, I don't know if enjoyed it was the right word, but talk about that. What did war mean to Hemingway?
So Hemingway was the grandson of combatants in the American Civil War. So he sort of grew up with that kind of romance or the sort of legend about going to war as a rite of passage. So when Hemingway went to war the first time, he went to the Italian front during World War I as a Red Cross volunteer because he couldn't medically pass into the U.S. Army because of his eyes. So he took the extraordinary step. Now, there were, of course, American volunteers and members of the American military. Most of those went to the Western Front. So to be in Italy made Hemingway a very unusual character, made his participation very unusual. And then Hemingway, so he goes to Italy in June of 1918. On July 8th, he's blown up by Austro-Hungarian trench mortar. And so he is seriously wounded in his legs about maybe just a few weeks after he gets there. And that incident of getting blown up really sort of gave birth to a lot of his early fiction, and most famously, A Farewell to Arms, which would come out 11 years later. But just to finish the notion about Hemingway and war, he would later go to the Spanish Civil War, which led to For Whom the Bell Tolls. And also he was a journalist during World War II. So he really did go to 3 wars very intensely.
Right. And I just got done. Actually, I was watching the Ken Burns documentary. I'm a big Ken Burns fan, and he covered the Civil War, which was obviously this amazing war. And I think some of the stats on that were, it was crazy, right? The amount of people who died. But so for Hemingway, I mean, talk about his writing a little bit. I mean, how would you describe, for somebody who maybe hasn't listened to, or hasn't read Hemingway, how would you describe his writing?
Well, it's important to understand that Hemingway began as a journalist. And the difference between fiction and journalism is probably obvious to most of us, to your listeners, which is that there are 2 different objectives. And so Hemingway really was influenced by the journalist's need for objectivity, for facts, as opposed to creating some kind of a emotion, like contriving some poetic emotion. And let me use a specific example that probably will make it more clear. If you've ever talked to a veteran or a soldier about his or her war experience, what I've found is you very rarely get, some emotional landscape of what happens. They usually tell you, it was raining,
right,
it was freezing cold, or it was on this particular day. They'll give you the fact. And you kind of have to read between the lines. You have to sort of supply the emotion, because you're rarely going to get an emotional rundown of what happened. And Dave, this is what Hemingway called the iceberg theory. Iceberg theory in the sense of he'll give you 1/8 of the visible text, but 7/8 is beneath the surface that is being suggested or implied or left out. So that sometimes when you read a Hemingway story, first-time readers can say, nothing's happening. Nothing's going on.
Right.
They're just talking about nothing. Well, Hemingway is depending on your participation, your collaboration, where you have to supply the meaning every bit as much as he does. So the 1/8 that he gives you is attempting to be evocative enough that you are going to be inspired to let your imagination do the rest of the work.
Oh, right. And does your imagination with Hemingway, can it go off in a place that maybe it's your own fiction? You're creating it from Hemingway?
So if the writer is doing it properly, you might have more than one possible reading, but you won't have an infinite number of readings. You are invited to let your imagination go. But so here's a way of thinking about it. Sometimes his characters will say, let me just pick an example. They'll say, yes, I said. Well, you don't hear how he says it. It's not, yes, I roared, or yes, I said with a snarl on my face. It's just, yes, I said. And so you and I could actually have it. It's like, well, how did you hear him say it? And you're like, well, I thought he was being a little sarcastic. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So you talk about it, you think about it, and you see what holds water and what really doesn't. And it's I'd say it's a risky or courageous way to write or create art, to say, like, I trust what I'm doing enough to let other people take it the rest of the way. But Dave, I bet you do this in your everyday conversation. Someone says, hey, how did the meeting go?
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, don't talk to me about work, or it was okay. And you just give them a hint, and they're like, oh, I bet there was a conflict, or I bet there was a tension or something like that.
Yeah.
This is the way we speak in human existence.
Yeah, that's right. Unless it's something really exciting where maybe you want to try to share it as best you can, the story, right? I mean, that's the amazing thing, is it's a story.
Unless it's positive.
Yeah, a positive, right.
If you get an award, I bet you'll share that in every detail. But if something is embarrassing or traumatic or humiliating or disappointing, you'll probably just give the bare minimum. And unfortunately, and this is almost a caricature with Hemingway, Hemingway usually writes about very difficult situations like men at war and romantic problems and family tension. And so you don't get a lot of effusion when you're narrating the story. You know, one of the things we can think about is, how do you tell stories that are difficult to tell, that involve unpleasant memories? And so this is all part of the Hemingway formula.
Where does that style that you described there, where he's letting you kind of fill in the blanks, where does that come from? Was that something that he, learned? Were there other writers that were doing that style?
It's a good question. I think that it comes from journalism, his journalism background, but also his subject matter, which is that the men of action that he writes about, which does not mean that they're not thoughtful, smart characters also. It just means that they're involved in crises or dangerous situations. And that is not usually given to a kind of a profusion of detail and description and emotion. Usually you're in a situation in a Hemingway novel where action is required more than thought.
Right. That's the characters that he enjoyed. Well, I mean, that was also him, right? I mean, with his life, do you think, think about the thing you mentioned a little bit, the hunting, the war, things like that. The fishing is one of those things. And obviously we talk a lot about fishing here. Where did that come from? And talk about his fishing. When did all of that start?
It started from day one. Hemingway, his family used to go to northern Michigan in the summers. They had a cabin up there. And Hemingway's father was a really excellent naturalist, in the sense of first of all, he was a doctor, but he also was a hunter and a fisher, and he loved nature. So he really exposed Hemingway to both a love of nature and a love of fishing and hunting. And there are pictures of Hemingway just as a little kid, as a toddler, holding a fishing pole, and then just slightly older holding a hunting rifle. So yeah, it was really with his father that he learned about a love of fishing up there.
Wow.
Have you ever been to the Northern Peninsula or Michigan?
Not to Michigan. We're heading back. We've been doing some stuff down to like South Shores of Lake Erie. So, but I'm hoping to get up. We have a lot of listeners in the Michigan and that whole part of the Great Lakes and everything.
Yeah, well, they know that these are things that I wonder if Hemingway even made these even more famous than they really are. Petoskey, Hortons Bay, and so forth. And Hemingway loved that, and he always wrote about that. It's very interesting. He wrote about that geographical space in his short stories. He never wrote about Oak Park, Illinois, which is where that was his actual home. But Michigan is where he went in the summer. And that is where he wrote some of his great early stories, like Indian Camp, Doctor and Doctor's Wife, The End of Something, and Big Two-Hearted River. These all take place in Michigan. So that was a real formative experience to be out in nature in that area.
Man, amazing. What was, I think of all the stories with what he wrote about and just some of the traumatic things that happened to him in his life. And you mentioned at the start the alcohol and all these things. Can you describe like him, kind of the real person versus kind of the myth of Hemingway? Because I think, or is it all combined? Is it the same thing? Like talk about that a little bit.
It's a great question. And you just mentioned the Ken Burns documentary. And I think the essential aspect of that documentary is that it tries to separate man from myth. The first thing I'll say about the difference between man and myth is that I blame Hemingway more than I blame any other person for the conflation of the actual human being and this Papa Hemingway character that was really unattractive and unappealing. He was a bragger, a womanizer, boozer, brawler. It was like, nobody likes this guy. What we like is the artist, the guy with a sensitivity to human experience and to war and to nature. And so that was the real person. And it got to where he maybe, and this happens with a lot of insecure people, not just with famous people like Hemingway, is that their bluster is like a defense mechanism. And Hemingway just happened to have this insecurity that forced him to act that way on sort of an international, global scale. And it was pretty cartoonish at times. But my preference, and this is to Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's great credit, and we talked about it when they were on One True Podcast, is that if you just look at the words on the page, it's absolute genius. And that outweighs all of the other nonsense, that he got into a bar fight or that he killed a tiger or something like that. I don't have much interest in that, certainly as much as the work.
Yeah, the work. And that's what it comes down to. So like a lot of people, not only famous people, but he did a lot of things that were, stuff you probably don't want to, talk about. But really, I mean, he was a great writer, and that's the stuff that, that's what he is remembered for. Right. Is that kind of what I guess we do. We don't look at that stuff as much, and we focus on those things that made him great. That's kind of what you're saying.
I agree to the extent, and this becomes very interesting because in the 20th century, it became easier to know about writers. There was more media, and so even someone like Mark Twain, he kind of had his image. I bet if I say Mark Twain, you're like, oh, white linen suit, yep, and the powdered hair. Right. And so you kind of have that image. Well, that wasn't an accident. He knew what he was doing. He was very smart. And so he got his picture taken, and that became his image. Walt Whitman was kind of like a disheveled bard. And Hemingway, anytime he killed a 400-pound marlin, he would be on the docks with a huge smile, and that picture would be all over the newspapers. Or if he killed something out in Africa, same thing.
So he did that, and so why did he do that? Why did he want to take the big photos, the big animals, the big fish?
My sense is, well, first of all, I have no doubt that he absolutely got joy out of it.
Yeah. And I will say, Mark, let me just say, the fishing thing is interesting because we talk about this a lot in the conservation. Part of this is there's a whole movement called Keep Them Wet, where you literally don't take fish out of the water because it hurts them. And so even to the point where people are starting to stop showing fish pictures of people holding fish because it's just like, hey, it's not good for the fish. Let's not promote it. You know what I mean? So this is an interesting topic, you know what I mean? Because Hemingway, it's not weird that he's doing that because many people love to show a big fish.
Was that even a movement, 50 years, 100 years ago, or is that more or less a new thing?
Yeah, that's like in the last 20 years, probably 15 years.
Okay, so Hemingway wouldn't have known about that, but maybe when he's out in Africa, focused on killing lions and all these, maybe, I don't know. So in the 1930s, when he's doing that, all I know about the 1930s is that that's not a time in American history where a lot of people had the money to go to an African safari. Right. That's quite I think prorated the money that he spent going to Africa and going on this really fancy safari, it must be over $100,000, of what it would cost today. So very few people. So that wasn't really what America was looking for in its artists in the 1930s. They were more looking for John Steinbeck and William Faulkner, who sort of had an eye towards labor and people who, didn't have it very well off in the 1930s, who were suffering. And sometimes when we suffer, we look to our artists to either bring us up or to hear us or to represent us. And with Hemingway, sometimes, and the reason I'm trying to connect this is because when he's beaming with that enormous marlin, it seems a little out of touch with maybe the way the rest of the country was operating at that time.
Yeah, right. And you mentioned Ken Burns. So did you have Ken Burns on your podcast?
We had Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, who co-directed that Hemingway documentary. Yes, we did.
Wow. How was that? How was that podcast?
Oh, it was wonderful. And they also co-wrote the introduction to our book, which is called One True Sentence, Writers and Readers on Hemingway's Art, which collects, we have as a sort of a game, we ask many of our guests, usually writers, what their one true sentence is from Hemingway's work. They get to choose one true sentence, and we talk about that once. We do kind of a deep dive on that one sentence. And so Ken Burns and Lynn Novick were kind enough to write the introduction. Yes, so they did something very shrewd, which was, as you might expect, one of the things that we think about with Hemingway in the year 2023 is like, oh, he's a dead white male.
Oh, right.
Why, he's representing, the sort of the mainstream or the establishment. And so there's kind of a backlash against people like Hemingway.
Oh, really?
And yes. And so what Burns and Novick did was they got people from all around the world to talk about how a Spanish writer would think about Hemingway, or how a woman would think about Hemingway, in ways that we don't normally connect. So what did Hemingway mean to all various people? So we got to see Hemingway from different perspectives. It was very well done.
Yeah, it was. And the one true sentence, I love that too. Maybe we'll ask you at the end your one true sentence, but I mean, it's basically the idea being that, like, tell something true, right? Tell your most passionate, like, one thing that you can, and is that kind of what we're talking about here? Don't make it up. Just one sentence. That's all you got. Hemingway
remembers telling himself, he wrote a memoir called A Moveable Feast, which talks about his life in Paris in the 1920s. And he said, anytime that I couldn't get it going, or he doesn't say writer's block, but that's kind of what he's talking about. He's like, I said, don't worry, you've done this before. All you have to do is write one true sentence and then go on from there. And I don't know if, people out there think about that. If you're stuck on something, sometimes all you need is that first step, that next step. And then it all kind of tumbles from there. And that's what Hemingway did. But when I heard you say, like, all he means is the true sentence. Well, what does that word true really mean? That's kind of it's a pretty basic adjective, but does it mean true like it really happened, true like it's authentic, or true like it works in the context of the story? So even the word true is slippery. I don't want to get all English professory on you, but you have to admit that word,
it's a good word.
It might mean something different. He doesn't say one excellent sentence or one brilliant sentence. He says one true sentence.
One true, yeah. Yeah, that's a good, exactly. And that's, just the epitome of his writing. We're thinking about it. We're talking about, like, what? Now, what is he talking about with true? That's exactly what, and when he wrote, that's what he knew he was doing that.
Let me try to connect something, if I could, to fishing about this topic. So Hemingway two of his passions, one was bullfighting and one was fishing. There were several, but those were two of them that we've already talked about. And so Hemingway remembers, he's like, these are two things that not everybody likes. So when you write about them, how do you explain? And I'm sure you and all of your listeners have had the experience of being on a wonderful fishing journey or trip, and it's like you want to share it with somebody who wasn't there. Well, sometimes, no offense, guys, but a fishing story is not as exciting as
that's right
to the person who actually did it. So Hemingway says, well, with bullfighting, what I realized was I found a detail, and that was that when the matador got gored, I saw his shin bone so white, gleaming through the blood and the dirt and his uniform. And he said, I knew if I could capture how white that was, that would, even you wouldn't have to like bullfighting, but the vividness, you would be there. And with fishing, he says, how am I going to explain how exciting this was? So he's talking about a deep sea fishing, and he says, you know what it was? My line was so taut that droplets of water were bouncing off of the line in the sun. He said, I knew if I could write that you wouldn't even have to like fishing or know much about it, but to know how tense the experience was.
Right. With a giant marlin on the other end.
Yeah, with a giant marlin, right. That's his notion of like a one true sentence or one true detail.
Yeah, right. And I've had one of our famous, we've had a few famous people on the podcast over the years, but John Gierach is a famous fly fishing writer. He's probably one of our most famous writers.
Oh, okay.
And he's written a lot of, just a lot of great stuff. And he talks about, Hemingway and Tom McGuane and some people like that. And just how they wrote. And I think he was talking about Tom when he mentioned, he talked about, instead of just saying, like in this example, the guy's finger was this old crippled, old guy with arthritis. And he said his hands were all mangled. And he said his his index finger was so bent. There's a couple ways you could do that. You could just say, hey, the guy's hand was mangled. It was bent. It almost looked, you know what I mean? Instead of just saying that, he would say that finger was so bent that if he made a gun with his hand and pointed at you in the face and pulled the trigger, that bullet would shoot you in the foot. Basically, right?
Terrific. That's terrific.
So is that kind of Hemingway too? Is that sort of stuff? Is that his style too?
So Hemingway would never write a sentence like that because I think it's so descriptive in that way. But that's brilliant.
Yeah.
I love that.
That's more Tom McGowan. I think that is Tom McGowan style.
Yeah, that is. But what it is it's showing instead of telling.
Yes, exactly.
And if you can say, oh, I have a cut, and that doesn't mean anything. But if you show someone the cut that you have, that is what really matters. So showing, not telling, that's a beautiful example of it. Another thought occurred to me that might be interesting about Hemingway's sort of journey as a fisherman. And that is in 1934. And again, I'm going to repeat this. This is during the height of the depths of the Depression. He bought a fishing boat. He bought a boat called Pilar.
Right.
Which was a boat that, I think it cost at the time over $7,000, which in the 30s, again, that would equate to well over $100,000, and is a 38-foot boat. And he loved this boat so much. He called it Pilar, which is also the name of maybe his greatest female character, Pilar in For Whom the Bell Tolls. And Hemingway had always said if he ever had a daughter, he would call her Pilar, but he never did. But it was this boat that he really used all the time. He took all kinds of people on this boat. And yeah, he was able to pursue this deep sea fishing off of Cuba, off of Key West.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I remember. That's kind of the challenge with Hemingway. Do you find that with your podcast that, or just talking about him, that he's got so many stories, so many great books that it's hard to cover everything? How do you look at that, and how do you look at your podcast?
Oh, that's an inspiration, though. That's, just like you never going to have enough trout streams to talk about or fishing, details and experiences. There'll never be enough. And with Hemingway, you always, you're going to run out of ideas. Well, you really are not. And to me, that's an indication of a great artist. You take someone like, Van Gogh, who really wasn't enormous. I guess he was prolific. He didn't live a really long life, but he did enough that you could talk about him forever in the way that you couldn't with a more minor artist. So with Hemingway, the last thing that I'm concerned about is getting to the end of we nailed it. We got everything. And the way that this type of investigation works, I don't know if you find the same way with fishing, is you have one podcast and that spawns like two different ideas for two more podcasts.
Oh yeah.
So it's not like when you talk to somebody that ends the inquiry. It actually stimulates further inquiry, at least if you're a curious person and your topic is sort of fertile.
Yeah, you said it. You said the key word was curious. I think that's the number one thing about being a good podcaster is being curious. And
it goes a long way, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the same. Every episode I do, there's always multiple guests, new ideas that come out. I'm like, oh yeah, I should have that person. I should do that topic. And that's what's amazing about it.
Well, Dave, there is something I'm curious about since I've never spoken to a fly fishing expert before.
Yeah.
And so there's a moment in Hemingway's work, and I don't want to take a detour if you don't want to, but
no.
So there's a posthumous book. It was published in 1970, 9 years after Hemingway's death, called Islands in the Stream. And there's a long set piece, maybe 20, 25 pages in that novel, where there's a young boy named Davy, who is the son of the protagonist, Thomas Hudson, named after a river, I might add. So he spends a long time battling this fish. And I think it's a marlin, although I might be wrong. I believe it's a marlin. And they're going back and forth. And at some point, Davy, who is, trying to land this fish, he says, I love this fish more than I've ever loved a person. And does this ever happen when you're battling a fish that you begin to identify with it? There's like the predator-prey,
Yeah.
almost association. Is that a real thing?
I think it might be for some people. I don't know if I've ever, I mean, I think of this and I haven't had a marlin on the end of my line. I haven't had some of these giant fish. I mean, probably
Okay.
I've had some big fish on. I mean, steelhead is one that I've fished a lot for. And I feel like I'm so in the moment of trying to land that fish that I'm not thinking about anything. I'm just totally into it.
So what does that mean? I mean, when you say I'm not thinking about anything, you must be thinking about something. Are you just reacting, or what is going through your consciousness?
I think I'm just thinking this thing is spooling my line and I'm getting ready to lose it and I don't want to. So I'm trying to just focus on everything I can do to turn that thing and get it in.
Oh, so you're thinking technically about things. That's interesting. So how long does it take you what's the longest it's ever taken you to land a fish?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's probably whatever, 20 minutes, maybe something like that. Yeah. So totally different.
Okay. So not it like, for instance, the Old Man in the Sea.
Yep.
It takes 3 days.
Right.
It takes him 3 days. He's tethered to that marlin for 3 days.
I know.
And at some point, Santiago says, "You are my brother, but I am going to kill you before the end of the day." So it's sort of it's both things at the same time. It's I love you, but I'm still going to kill you at the end.
I know. Well, and I will say for hunting, that this is a little bit different because I do a little bit of hunting and deer hunting. I do have that moment where I'm getting ready to shoot it, and and then also you get to a point where you're getting it out, and it's just this visceral thing where you're, and you're appreciating it. I mean, you're more. I understand. I appreciate that animal. I'm sacrificing it because I'm feeding my family.
That's interesting. So no hatred or disdain or anything like that. It's respect.
Yeah, definitely.
Like in hunting cultures, there's a famous moment in The Sun Also Rises where they're talking to the bullfighter, and he says, "The bulls are my brothers." And they go, "Oh, really? You kill your brothers?" Like, "Yes, so they don't kill me." And so it's kind of an understanding of that cyclical nature of predator prey. So Hemingway was quite sophisticated in that. But Hemingway has this young guy. I mean, he's maybe 10 years old. He's understanding that even as a kid, that there's something grander about than just trying to land a fish. You're doing something much more in tune with nature.
Yeah, yeah. Did the I'm not sure on Hemingway. Like I think of Native American tradition,
right?
Especially with sacrificing, and the same thing, right? The animals were their family, but they sacrificed salmon and animals. Did some of that come from Hemingway? Was he around, or where did that come from?
So, in terms of Native Americans, the northern Michigan was where that was Ojibwe, and he was, as I mentioned, his early short story Indian Camp featured Native Americans prominently. So yes, he was very invested in their culture. Yeah. I'm not sure if I would say, I've never made the connection that he had any kind of philosophy of hunting or fishing because of Native Americans, but I do know that he has a short story called 10 Indians, another called The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife. So he has plenty. They often are characters in his early work, for sure.
Yeah. And you mentioned, we talked The Old Man in the Sea. I mean, that book was, what a story, right? I mean, this giant fish, the struggle, then he doesn't have the fish, it gets eaten. I mean, talk about that, but what do you, is that, I don't know. I mean, it seems like that's probably one of the most known books. For you, are they all great, or do you have a list of like, hey, these are kind of the top, this is the top 10, top whatever?
I think there's an understanding of which ones are masterpieces and which ones are sort of more minor works. And I don't have a favorite. I usually, because I teach several of them and I kind of do it in rotation, it's usually the next one that I'm about to write about or teach I'm the most enthusiastic about. I'm in the middle of a project on A Farewell to Arms. So that would be my current favorite. Like, oh yeah, I'm sort of interested in that. With The Old Man in the Sea, what's interesting is that was sort of based on a true story. And Hemingway published The Old Man in the Sea in 1952. He had the idea for that as early as the 1930s. And it's the perfect Hemingway theme of winner take nothing. So that's actually something to ask a fisherman about, which is, do you count it as a win if you land the marlin after days of battle, you strap it to your boat, and then the sharks can eat it before you get to either eat it yourself or sell it. So you've sort of done the work, but you don't get the reward. So where does that leave you? Do you get internal satisfaction from it, or is it all wasted effort?
Right. Yeah, that is crazy. I think in present day, I think of it as a win. It's still a win, but back then, I don't know if it would be, because the food was, fish like that was important. It seems like maybe that wasn't a win.
For Santiago, it wasn't sport. It was important. And there's a very interesting shift at the beginning of The Old Man and the Sea. So he's talking about fishing off the coast of Cuba, and he says that Santiago has a young helper named Manolin, and Manolin's father wants this boy to help the commercial fishermen who have the new modern equipment, and they're successful because they have all these modern methods and modern equipment, and they get a lot of fish, and they get more money, and they have a steadier income. Manolin loves the old man, Santiago, who still has a skiff, and he's doing it all the way he has done it his entire life. And he's not that successful, or he's been on a really unlucky streak. So I think this is a broader issue about nature and business, is that when does capitalism take over? And so I always wonder how The Old Man and the Sea would be different if Manolin went with Santiago and disobeyed his father and said, no, I'm going to help you today and we can do it together. It would be a much different story. But no, Santiago had to do it alone. And what's Manolin doing? Manolin has to provide for his family. So he makes a choice. He has sacrifices some aspect of his loyalty or his ethics so that he can provide for his family. And it is a sacrifice. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Well, one thing I've been thinking about, and I'm kind of going to the end, I guess, with Hemingway. But at the end of his life, he committed suicide, right?
Yes.
In another extreme, right? Another one of these things. I kind of understand why, but talk about that. What why did that occur? Is that something that surprises you when you look at his life, or is that something you kind of expect? Yeah, that's kind of the way I'd expect that to end.
It doesn't surprise me. His father killed himself in 1928 as Hemingway was editing A Farewell to Arms. And Hemingway went through an enormous period of depression and mental illness. He had shock therapy at the Mayo Clinic. This is something that if this happened in 2023, one would imagine, and again, this is above my pay grade, but one would imagine the treatment would be more sophisticated. The medication, he was having these paranoid spells. There's a sort of a cliche that says, oh, Hemingway killed himself because he couldn't write anymore. Well, I guess at the basest level, that's true. But he really killed himself because he was tortured mentally. If you look at the Ken Burns documentary, to me, one of the most striking things is that he aged so quickly that he goes from this young, handsome guy in his 30s, then he goes to World War II, and all of a sudden, he's literally an old man in his 40s. And I'm not saying that to offend 40-year-olds. Yeah. I'm saying that most 40-year-olds that I know are youthful and healthy, and he just looked like he had lived a full life at 40. And so by the time he dies at 61 years old, and if you look at that, he looked way older than that. He looked gaunt. He looked like an old man in that. So he really did. And, the alcohol didn't help that. So he had physical injuries to his head. He had mental illness and alcoholism. And that is a bad combination.
Yeah, that's not good. And the alcoholism, was that something that, he was an alcoholic. He drank that's obviously going to kill you eventually.
So when your word eventually, I think is sharp, because in the 20s, when he's in Europe and it's like, hey, people drink, with every meal in Paris, and that's all fine when you're young and active and your body can process that. But this has an accumulating effect, and it became way too much. And nobody can doubt that really did, who knows where the lines are, but it must have accelerated the downward spiral.
Let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. Waters West Fly Fishing Outfitters is your go-to resource for spay and swung fly techniques for the OP and beyond. They are known for their deep selection of unique, high-quality fly tying materials, and they are the gateway to some of the great steelhead rivers in the country. I was able to get out on the water with Ed, and it was an amazing day. We hit the shop early, met him at the shop. We fired up the old vehicle and headed out on the river. Ed is the type of guy that you feel comfortable right from minute one, and it was a good day. We ended the trip 4-bying into this unimproved boat ramp, pulling the boat out, and we ended up with a great opportunity and landed a nice, very nice chromer and had a few other touches. Fished one of the great rivers in the country. It was amazing. Not only do they cover steelhead, but all species in the area, and they have a passion for all fish that swim up or live around salt. They can outfit any angler from the beginner to the most hardcore fishing bum you can imagine. They have a great online store, fast shipping, and you will be supporting conservation when you support Waters West. Please check in with Ed and Kyle right now to say hi and let them know you heard from them on this podcast. And you can do that right now, wetflyswing.com/waterswest. Pauline, talk about that person. Maybe just give us somebody that doesn't know any of the history. Who was that person and what was the influence on Hemingway?
So Hemingway was married 4 times, and Pauline Pfeiffer was his second wife. And one of the interesting things about Pauline Pfeiffer, especially for listeners of this podcast, is that Pauline had a really wealthy uncle named Gus, and Gus financed their safari in the early 30s. So Hemingway was able to enjoy this extended hunting trip into Africa because of Pauline's father. Of course, then they divorced, and Hemingway went on to Martha Gellhorn. That was around the period of the Spanish Civil War. And then he went on to Mary, who was his widow for the rest of his life. And that was, he was married 4 times. So it was very interesting. People call him a womanizer, and there's various truth to that. He really kind of went from wife to wife to wife. It wasn't like he had a long time of bachelorhood. He would wait until he had another wife in waiting before he divorced the previous wife. It was a little bit peculiar.
Right. He always had to have somebody there. Like that.
That's correct.
And he loved, right? He kind of loved being in love and the whole thing. That's kind of his part of his thing, right? He enjoyed that.
Yes. And he seemed like he wanted his wives to take care of him. And to various extent, they did. And, the third wife, Martha, had no interest in doing that because she was a journalist herself, and she didn't want to put up with a needy, husband. And Mary was much more willing to play that part of, Mrs. Hemingway.
Yeah. We mentioned that the bullfighting is interesting to me because I don't know much about it. And was it Death in the Afternoon? That was the book?
Yes, Death and Bullfighting. So as a novel, it's The Sun Also Rises. And as a nonfiction book, it's Death in the Afternoon, which is essentially like a textbook about bullfighting. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, because it's interesting. It is this the way when you look at how it goes down. What do you think caught him? I guess we've talked about he just loves those, why did bullfighting? Well, maybe just bring us back. How did he get into the bullfighting, and then why did he love it so much?
So bullfighting was, I don't even need to speculate because he explains what he loves about bullfighting. And he says, for me, the only place you could go to see violent death once the war was over was the bullfights. And the bullfights, how many bulls are going to die, when they're going to die and where they're going to die. So you can actually go and if you're a writer, you can study that process. You can study the bravery of the matador, how he behaves. Let's say, how does he behave when he's in trouble? How does he behave when he's victorious? How does he behave when he's getting knocked around by the bull? And so all of these things, and Hemingway is absolutely fascinated by them, about how does a man look in crisis? And you could find that at war, although of course that's not so easy to say, okay, I'm going to go to the nearest war just so I can study. Right. So bullfighting is kind of an organized version of that. And it's kind of like the difference between a bar fight and a boxing match. A bar fight is chaotic. You don't really know when they're going to happen, and there's no rules. But a boxing match has rules, and you can go and study that as kind of a process or an art form. At least that would be useful. Dave, I did want to say one thing about the Sun Also Rises that I think you would be particularly insightful about. And this is just something, a random moment that happens towards the end of this great early novel. So this comes out in 1926. And there is a moment in Spain when Jake Barnes, the protagonist, and his friend Bill Gorton, they take a break from the bullfights and they go fishing at Burguete on the Arati River. Have you ever had anybody on to talk about fishing Spain?
Well, let's see. We've had some Spanish. I don't think we've talked specifically. No, not yet.
So they're going to fish the Arati River, and they're very interesting. So Bill decides to fly fish, and Jake is fishing with a worm. And Bill goes above the dam, and Jake fishes down below. And Bill is much more successful, catches more fish and bigger fish. And so, first of all, like that's the first takeaway. And so I want to stop by asking you, is Hemingway meaning to say, if you use more exertion, if you use a more active or creative means, you're going to get rewarded more? Or is this a coincidence?
Right. And was the fly fisherman was the one that caught more?
Yes.
Yeah. Man, that is a good one. That's a good one. I think that's funny because that comes up a lot in just our conversations where it's like, okay, you got fly fishing. Why do you fly fish? And it's always this interesting thing because a lot of people start out conventional fishing, like as kids, you start out fishing with the worm and then you start with gear and then you slowly, fly fishing is not easy. And so a lot of people think that we fly fish because it's the harder thing to do. It's that thing. And then what do you do once you become the master of fly fishing? What's next? There's always something you're trying to make it harder. So it's this interesting thing that we talk about. So I feel like that's probably part of it where, somebody fishing with the fly, maybe not that they're, a better, whatever, an angler or a better person or anything. It's just that, it's kind of known that it is a little harder to catch a fish on a fly versus a worm.
So it's harder, but do you expect bigger fish and more of them or not necessarily?
No, I don't think.
Really? Interesting.
There's times when that happens, but I think you expect bigger and more fish with bait and gear.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, okay. So this happens and then they have a great time. They are very happy that they did it. And then they run into another character whose name is Harris. And they join up together and they're fishing together. And they notice that there's a monastery, which is the monastery of Roncesvalles, so it's a classic religious structure. And they're like, oh, look at that. It's quite a thing. And Harris, this guy that they just meet up with, they say, yeah, it's very splendid, but it's not like fishing, is it? And they go, no, it's not. Which is to say that in this post-war generation, the modernists, the expatriates, the lost generation, they had to find religion in other things that weren't necessarily their parents' religion. It wasn't necessarily that they were anti-religion. It was that they were looking for a religious experience. Right. And Hemingway found it in fishing. That was one thing. So just that comment, they said, it's a grand place, but it's not like fishing, is it? And then, right before the guys are about to go to Pamplona, Harris meets these guys again, and he gives them a dozen flies that he has tied. And that's the great offering that affirms the connection that they made when they were fishing.
Right. God, that's so good. And the religion is amazing because that's another thing that comes up in fly fishing too. Not only religion, not necessarily religion, but just meditation and talking about how really it's not about the fishing. It's not necessarily even about the catching. It's about the experience and the
sacred experience.
Yeah. The experiences. And so that's amazing. Yeah. And well, obviously with Hemingway, if you don't know Hemingway that well, there's a lot of work to read. What do you tell somebody if they, are listening now, there's all these books. Is there a starting point? Where do you start with Hemingway if you want to just dig into it?
Absolutely. So, first of all, The Old Man and the Sea is not only a really great story, it's not that demanding. It's about 90 pages and it's told in pretty straightforward English. So, even if you're, haven't read Hemingway before, I think that would be a really good place to start. But I might even suggest a short story, which isn't it's kind of a longer short story. Maybe it's like 30, 35 pages. And it's called Big Two-Hearted River.
Yeah.
And I think this is Hemingway's early masterpiece. It's about a character named Nick Adams, who he's all by himself. And all it does is show him walking through the Michigan woods, reaching the river, camping and fishing. And it's never mentioned, but it becomes apparent that he's coming home from the war. And he's trying to do a couple of things. First of all, he's trying to re-immerse himself into something that he loved before he had that traumatic experience. And second of all, he's trying to determine how much excitement he can withstand. Can he fish the swamp? Can he go waist high into the stream of rushing water? And how would that affect him? So he's using fishing to gauge his current state of mind, his current capacity. And this is something that Hemingway later said, it's a story about coming home from the war with no mention of the war in it. So this goes back to the iceberg theory that we started our conversation with, where Hemingway, it's almost like, all right, so it's a story of a guy camping and fishing and eating by the tent. Who cares? Well, obviously it's a lot more loaded than that.
Yeah. And the war we have, just in the fly fishing space, there's a number of groups that use fly fishing for people coming back from the war.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, they take them out. There's a number of groups around the country, but basically they use that for healing. Like people that have never fly fished before, they take them out and they get them on the water, and it helps them, right? It's that time where they're thinking about something other than war.
Well, can I ask why would fly fishing ever be, let's say, too exciting or too much? Like, would you have to sort of ease somebody into that? Or is fly fishing generally a nice therapeutic activity?
Yeah, I think it is. It's there. I mean, there is some challenges about, the casting of the rod and the fly, and it takes some skill. And there's a whole world of digging into entomology and biology and everything. But it can be really simple. Learning to cast, seeing a fishing rising to a bug that's hatching off the water, and and then
right? That's right.
So you get in this world of, I guess, I haven't been to war, like I said at the start, so I don't know, but I think that's what people enjoy because they can think about something other than, PTSD and everything else they're dealing with.
For sure. And this character, Nick Adams, he is, he's taking you right through it. And this would be before PTSD was even a thing. I think that it was referred to as shell shock, but even that was in its very basic form, in the early 1920s or right after World War I. And so he has this, it's almost like the fairy tale where he's like, well, he catches one trout, it's too small. He catches another trout, it's too big, it's too much of a fight, he's not ready for it. And then he catches another one that's just right. It's just, so he finds his limits. And, I'm sure, Hemingway, more than fly fishing, was a deep fisherman. And I'm sure that, well, I shouldn't say I'm sure, I should ask you, but is there a deep fisherman therapy for soldiers returning home from the war, or is fly fishing more conducive to that kind of pace?
Oh, right. You mean like deep sea, like out in the ocean?
Exactly. Right.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there is. I'll bet there's something. I mean, the fly fishing has become, it used to be very one-sided, trout fishing, but now it's like people are out there fishing for these giant marlin now with fly rods. Yeah, so pretty much any fish on the planet you can catch with a fly rod now. So I'd imagine maybe there are some of those groups doing it, but for the most part, I think they're keeping it simple, trout fishing and basic stuff.
Right.
But yeah, this is, well, and we're going to try to wrap this up as best we can here in a bit. But again, going back to his books, you mentioned a couple. when you look at his life and the evolution of maybe you can describe that a little bit. How did it go back kind of to the start and really, and just kind of go through that kind of quickly, talk about how his writing involved in some of those books along the way?
When we think of Hemingway's greatness, like what won him the Nobel Prize, what we're really thinking about is there's a span of 5 years from 1925 to 1929 where he writes 2 volumes of short stories and The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms. So it's 4 books in 5 years that really made him a literary superstar. The 1930s, somewhat less successful. He was way more interested in bullfighting and hunting and safaris than he was in novel writing. Then, which makes his comeback in 1940 for Whom the Bell Tolls so triumphant. It was almost like a redemptive novel.
Right.
Like, we didn't think he had it in him. And that's from 1929 to 1940. That's a long time to go for a relatively young artist between masterpieces, but that is what happened. And then he doesn't do another really major work until 1952, which is The Old Man and the Sea. So it's, you got to really kind of hopscotch. So I would say Hemingway wasn't a prolific writer, but at his best, he was as good as there is.
Wow. Do you think he would have been more prolific if, there wasn't some of these things in there, alcohol, some of these other things that distracted him maybe?
We could ask that about any
right.
musician, any rock star.
Drugs and alcohol, right.
Right. If they didn't and then you have the argument, he needed that to do it.
Exactly.
So this is something I don't know much. Here's what I would say here's my guess is that there's probably a level of excess, a level of drinking and adventure that is just right, that you could sustain for a longer period of time. And Hemingway went way beyond that. So if he had restrained himself, I'm sure, but that wasn't, it wasn't who he was. He was it wasn't who Jim Morrison was either. Right.
Right. Do you think Hemingway was kind of, like optimistic, dark? How would you describe, or kind of everything? What would, like, himself, the person?
So it was funny you mentioned that, because just a couple days ago, I read this line from Death in the Afternoon where he says, all stories end in death, and he is no true storyteller who hides that from his readers. I was like, wow, that is pessimistic, even by Hemingway standards, But then again, he's not wrong, right?
Right.
And then he says, if 2 people love each other, there can be no happy end to it. And my immediate reaction is, how dare you? That's so morbid. And then you're like, well, he's right. I mean, one person 99.99% of the time, even in the best marriage, ends up mourning another person. And so Hemingway, some of his works, and A Farewell to Arms is one of them, is drenched in that kind of fatalism. Now, personally, with his 4th wife, particularly, she always described him as like waking up in the morning, being positive about his writing, about what they were going to do that day, about going fishing. And he was always sort of enthusiastic, infectiously so. But when it came to writing, he didn't hide how every story ends. Like, we know how it all ends.
Yeah, that's right. Did we know, as far as the suicide, I think when he first died, I mean, that's pretty much common knowledge now, but at the time, did they kind of try to hide that because he was such a famous person?
So just to back up a little bit, so he died in 1961. In 1954, when he was on a safari, he got into a plane crash with his wife, and the plane that picked him up to bring him to safety crashed also. So he's one of the few people who got into 2 plane crashes in a row, right?
Wow.
And that was reported that he had died in a plane crash way back in 1954. So that wasn't, of course, that sort of added to the myth. But then when he did commit suicide, his wife reported it as a gun cleaning accident. And whether that was intentionally deceitful because she didn't want it to get out, or maybe she's a panicked widow in, just like not, she thinks it at the time because she's just has deceived herself. Who knows? I don't know what her motive was, but it was reported that he had an accident with a gun. It was absolutely suicide. And there were moments leading up to that suicide where he had either vowed to do it or attempted to do it. There's one moment he tried to walk into the spinning propellers of a plane.
Jeez.
In an airport. Yep.
Oh, wow.
And they caught him right before he did it.
Holy cow. Jeez.
Imagine if he had committed suicide that way.
Damn. Right. And didn't his wife at the time, I mean, I think she kind of knew obviously what was going on and didn't really, didn't hide the guns or anything like that. She kind of just naturally let whatever happened happen.
So I think she was in a situation where if you hide the guns from the person that you love, it's almost like she would feel like she was offending him or not giving him dignity. This is kind of like, this happens in Death of a Salesman, believe it or not. Now that I'm thinking about it, is that, but we'll do that on another podcast.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So it's like, I want to give him the dignity. And so of course, Monday morning quarterback is like, well, how could you give the guy the gun? And she had locked it in the cabinet, but left the key or something along those lines. He killed himself in Ketchum, Idaho. And way out west, and Hemingway's west was Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. So that is where they have I've never been out there, but that's where his Hemingway house is. Have you ever been out to Idaho?
Yeah, I mean, I've been through there quite a few times. I've never been by. I'm going to definitely check it out. We're heading out there next month, so definitely.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it was I want to say, Dave, the Sun Valley, which I know is probably a popular destination. Oh, yeah. So Hemingway had this deal where they said, you can come out here to Sun Valley. This is before it was really a thing. This might have been, late 30s, early 40s. And they said, you come out here, let us take your picture and use it for publicity, and you can have the run of the place. You can hunt for free, fish for free, and stay for free. And he did it. He drove cross country and he stayed there. They had, I think Gary Cooper had the same deal. And Hemingway absolutely fell in love with that neck of the woods.
That's amazing. I feel like Hemingway, I'm just guessing, but I feel like he loved hunting and fishing so much that, he was kind of like, okay, I'll write my books, my great books, and then I'll take 10 years in between just to enjoy life. Do you think that's kind of because he was writing still, wasn't he, in that period?
He certainly was. In fact, he edited A Farewell to Arms out west, and he has mentions of, his character in For Whom the Bell Tolls, Robert Jordan, is from Montana. His character in Across the River and Into the Trees is from Montana. So yeah, he was very, very partial to that. At his best, he was disciplined to write in the morning and then go on Pilar and go fishing in, Key West or Cuba or whatever. And he would have that routine where he'd be like, okay, I'm going to get up really early. I'm going to do the day's work. And then I get to, and of course,
play.
Yeah, exactly. And then of course the discipline kind of gets a little weaker as we go along.
Yeah, that's right. Wow. Well, there's definitely a number of things I want to follow up with you on, maybe on the next one. I want to hear it on the podcast. So why did you start? I mean, podcasting, not everybody does a podcast. I know it's a lot of work. How did that come to be for you? And was it pretty obvious what you were going to do it on?
Well, I love podcasts. And probably the way I got into podcasts is, on dog walks. I walk my dog and I listen to podcasts, and I found them really entertaining. I learned a lot. I was like, okay, I want to listen to a Hemingway podcast, and there was none. So my friend Michael Von Cannon and Michael Von Cannon is a great Hemingway scholar, and he's very adept at production and technology. So he did that part, and I'm the host. And we've been really lucky that we invite people on and they talk about all various parts of Hemingway. David, it feels like even today on our brief conversation, we've hit on like so many different aspects of Hemingway's life. So there's never a shortage of things to talk about. So yeah, One True Podcast has become a real, the Hemingway Society sponsors it. And so both specialists in Hemingway seem to enjoy it, but also people who maybe are just curious about Hemingway's life or certain of his activities.
Right. So if we go over there and listen to some of those, we can just get a feel, just basically dig deeper and hear from other people what Hemingway was about and his stories and everything?
You can. One of the ones I would recommend to this crowd is by a guest of ours named Paul Hendrickson. We interviewed him about Hemingway's boat.
Nice.
Pilar.
Yeah.
He's an expert on that. And so we talked about the boat and Hemingway's love of fishing. So yeah, there should be something for just about everybody.
Awesome. I'm excited. Yeah, I always love getting a new podcast or adding some podcasts to the queue. So I want to, and I'll put in the show notes that episode, and then also the Ken Burns and some other stuff we talked about today. But I also want to hear on your podcast, if you had to look at your feed right now, what's another podcast that you're listening to that you're liking? Anything? It sounds like you're kind of like me. You love listening to a lot of different podcasts.
Oh yes, I do. I'd hate to, what my guilty pleasure, and this isn't my guilty pleasure, is like sort of a source of shame, is I'm a Mets fan.
Oh yeah.
So I'm from New York, if you couldn't tell from my
No,
voice.
I couldn't.
Yeah. I guess I've been in Indiana long enough, but I'm a Mets fan. And so I listen to a Mets podcast. And the reason I like it is because I get to commiserate with another depressed person just like me, during that. So
what's it called? Is there a name? Is it just the Mets podcast?
No, it's called the Rico Brogna Podcast with Evan Roberts, who is a insane Mets fan. And he's the person I have to turn to when I'm going through a particularly rough time with the Mets. I also do it with him. But what you're saying is exactly right, is that for me, podcasts lead to podcasts. So I'll jump to do, I would never have been interested in this, but then I'll go off to it and I'll find something. There's also, if I'm teaching something or if I'm writing about something, there's a work of art or a writer that I'm particularly interested in. So I'll bounce around and I'll just try to get as much knowledge as possible.
It's amazing. I think the podcasting space has been really cool because it seems like it's that place where, long form content, you don't really hear interviews, like this in many places. I think so. That's really cool. But in the Mets, so I'm going to just go on this a little bit because I have a little bit of sports background in my past.
Okay.
But, so, I mean, my memory of the Mets was, because I was a big baseball fan, I remember the Dwight Gooden, right? That Darryl Strawberry, right? That time with...
Exactly.
So back in that time, I mean, what's your thought? I don't even know right now. Are they just up and down always? Or was that the greatest time ever for the Mets?
First of all, that was the greatest time ever for the Mets. I think that was the greatest time ever for the world to have Darryl Strawberry and Dwight Gooden and Keith Hernandez. And
who was their catcher?
Gary Carter.
Yeah, Carter.
Yeah, it was just so great. And then I was young enough to think that was the way it was always going to be.
Yeah, the 80s. Was that the late 80s?
It was the early to mid 80s, right? And then, it's funny, just what we've been talking about with Hemingway, where excess and...
cocaine, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so you'd have the guy like Darryl Strawberry and Dwight Gooden, whose talent would be just limitless. And remember the question you just asked, which is, what would Hemingway's career have looked like if he didn't drink or he didn't do all this nonsense? I would ask the same question about the Mets. Like, what could have been? It's very sad, that to see that waste of talent.
It is sad. And was that before? That was like right before the steroid era, right? Or was that a long ways before?
That was right before it. Yep, that was right before that. So the steroid era seems like it would be late 80s, early 90s. Does that sound about right?
I think so, yeah, because it was the big players were like Barry Bonds, Mark
Sosa,
McGwire, right?
Yeah,
all that 80s, late 80s, 90s.
Exactly, yeah. Do you have a team?
I don't. I mean, I guess Seattle Mariners. I mean, just because I'm up in the Northwest. But
okay, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I don't watch a lot of sports anymore mainly because I got kids and a lot of stuff going, but I do love sports. So every time I can get a chance to watch a little bit of a game, it's awesome.
I've done a real disservice to my older son, who I brought him up a Mets fan, and it was really no excuse for me to do that. It's a form of child abuse.
Right. Well, I feel a little bit because we have the Portland Trail Blazers. That's our team.
Right.
So they've done the same thing. I mean, they've had 3 times where they've had a chance. Other than that, it's been not great.
It just never happens.
And the Yankees, tell me this, because the Yankees, like, how does that feel? Because it just seems like it's unfair over the years, like with the Yankees. Why does that occur? Why don't they make it more like football? It seems like football is more even now. Why are the Yankees and these teams have the better teams or better players?
It's exasperating, especially because I lived in New York during when it seemed like the Yankees won just about every year. And they didn't just win, they were really obnoxious about it. And the fans were really obnoxious about it. And I come out here to Indiana where I work now and live, and I see a Yankee hat. And I say, like, I came out here to avoid seeing
They're
that
everywhere.
hat. Yeah, I can't escape it. And yeah, the Yankees are, it's just they're sort of the rich guy across the street that you always look at and you say,
Yeah.
what this guy, I can't compete.
You can't compete. All right. Well, and let's leave it on this. Let's hear your one true sentence. We'll leave it on that.
Oh, okay. Oh, for my one true sentence for me. Wow. Okay, so let's talk about The Sun Also Rises. And in the novel, The Sun Also Rises, is not really a spoiler. In the entire novel, one person dies. This person is named Vicente Girones. He's a side character that we never even meet. He has died during the running of the bulls. In other words, you've seen the running of the bulls where they run the bulls through the streets of Pamplona and thousands of people run with him, and occasionally one person gets trampled or what have you. So one person gets trampled, and it's this guy. And our main characters say, like, hey, how did everything go today? And someone goes, oh, someone was killed. And, one person was killed out there. And the end of the chapter is the character Bill Gorton saying, was there? ? And so now I want to pick up exactly what we were talking about earlier, which is, how does he say that? Was there? Does he say like, oh, was there? Like flipping a magazine? Or does he go, was there? Like in horror? Or is there somewhere in between on the spectrum? And what I love about this, and this is going to also bring in the iceberg theory, is that there's a difference between being vague, which is not satisfying and is not good expression, and being ambiguous. If you're being intentionally ambiguous, something can mean more than one thing at the same time. And to me, that's exciting. So was there changes every time I read that book, that sometimes I'm like, oh, he's being flippant. But then sometimes I'm like, wow, he's really being empathetic or sad. And I love that a book can be dynamic even after so many times reading it. So I'm going to go with was there from The Sun Also Rises.
Perfect. That is awesome. All right, Mark, well, I think we'll leave it there. We will send everybody out. We've got the onetruepod.com. They can check out your podcast. We'll definitely get some more subscribers for you there, and we'll keep following you. I definitely appreciate all the everything today and all the good work you've been doing over the years, and excited to keep in touch with you.
Anytime, Dave. This has been a real pleasure.
That is a wrap. You can grab all of the show notes at wetflyswing.com. And please follow us on Instagram and share this episode out with someone you love. Please send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, if you have any feedback or want us to put together an episode on this podcast for you. Check in anytime. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and would love to meet up with you on the water. We have new fly fishing schools going all year long and all around the country, so if you want to connect, let's do it right now. All right, time to get out of here. I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great morning or great afternoon wherever in the world you are, and I appreciate you for stopping by and checking out the show today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.